Hello, my name is Merle McGee, and I'm the President and CEO of Everyday Democracy. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our virtual conversation series, Doing Democracy. Today, we are focused on waging love for an inclusive democracy. For over 30 years, Everyday Democracy has engaged ordinary people in brave and inclusive and substantive dialogue and collective decision making to solve local problems. So, to kick off our conversation today, I wanted to share a report I came across recently from researchers at Harvard Graduate School of Education, a report called Loneliness in America that looked at COVID-19 drivers of loneliness in adults and young people. The study concluded in February of 2021 found that among adults, 36% of respondents reported serious loneliness, feeling lonely frequently or almost all the time or all the time. This included 61% of young people aged 18 to 25. Many felt like they didn't feel like anyone cared enough to connect with them. And young adults, in fact, do suffer higher rates of anxiety and depression, according to a recent CDC survey. Now, we know disruptions in social development and technology also played a significant role in driving mental health challenges and contributed to loneliness. But very interestingly, a follow up study by the same group published in October of 2024 found that loneliness may not only be the cause, but the result of a wide range of troubling feelings that often interact in complex ways. Respondents who reported loneliness were far more likely to report anxiety and depression and a lack of meaning and purpose, and the sense that their place in the world was important. For example, 81% of lonely adults reported anxiety or depression, and about 75% of lonely adults reported having little or no meaning or purpose. Striking numbers of respondents didn't feel that they were even a part of this country. Now, the report offered amongst interventions promoting a culture of caring and service. But what caught my attention was the need to build a social infrastructure that enables people to find and sustain meaningful connections. Now, we know historically that has been faith communities, civic spaces, schools, sports teams, and other things like that. But it left me wondering, what does it mean for so many young people to feel so disconnected or unmoored from our social fabric? What does it mean for interpersonal relationships with families, friends? What does it mean for our democracy to have our future generations not feel a sense of connection or continuity with democratic norms and values? Of course, it left me wondering, what can we do? And how can we lead them back to community? I say love. Love, love as a practice. Love is a practice, something you do. Baldwin speaks of love as witnessing, encouraging, and mirroring, magnifying each other's light. Love is active in its effort to behave as though one sees another person's humanity. So, what does that mean for democracy? And why in this conversation? If love is active, then democracy is the framework to animate loving principles. Waging love is to practice empathy, connection, and it's also to think critically about the state of humanity and to act in life affirming ways. Democracy offers a framework to make policies and set norms for governance that's rooted in love. Because democracy is, after all, a series of relationships that shape how we engage, navigate conflict, and actually practice love. So, waging love in our democracy is to act as though our fates are intertwined, that our struggles and our hopes are, in fact, bound together. At Everyday Democracy, we're doing this through our innovative programming, training everyday people like local librarians to hold difficult but necessary conversations to weave the social fabric in their communities. We're supporting young leaders to engage their neighbors and use civic tools to solve local problems together. And we're helping communities look at their shared history and commit to healing and repair together. We're so excited to be with you for these next 90 minutes to wage love. We know today America is lonelier, perhaps even more divided, and more afraid than ever. But we are here to declare that we will build together a democracy that is rooted in justice, belonging, and the unshakable belief in each other. Now, to start us off, we have an offering from Deshaun Ahanu. And Deshaun is a poet, an MC, a cultural organizer, playwright, performance artist, lecturer, educator, and the former Piedmont Poet Laureate of North Carolina. Welcome, Deshaun, and please take us away.
They say that in the midst of a blackout, a neighborhood gathered in a playground with lit promises, raised their voices in jubilation, and lifted candles to the sky. There, a dim night learnt the meaning of a great light and came to understand a joyful noise. They say that over the shoulder of a dismissive authoritarian, there was a rising frustration building in students who were destined to bring billions. There, bright promises determining that their success would be a rebellion, their graduation would be an event horizon. Between a community's genesis and a tomorrow's dawn, I have come to see the blessing of a promising day and the power of a revolutionary night. I know what God's craftsmanship looks like, know where to find radiant eyes and resilient smiles that remind me of the sun and the moon. Each week here is a fashion show. Between every morning and another midnight is a curtain waiting to open to remind us of our magic, calling us to catwalk to an affirming applause, will crafted by experience and vision, survival sewn, tradition and history patchworked all into a glorious couture. How can you not believe you are of a beautiful kind when you have models all around? Leaders who show us that fashion forward is a stylish strength. Dreamers who show you that an eclipse just gives the sun time to remember its purpose. Warriors who remind you that dusk is not an ending. It is just the bottom of a page that, when turned, will reveal that words are waiting at the top of the morning. Silence is never an option. There are days that can't be called anything other than inspirational. There is no mannequin complacency here, no prepackaged apathy. Here, a resilient courage exists, a determined flair for the transformational, dressed in Be Bold, outfitted in Been Amazing, and accessorized and ain't gonna be made to be any less. My God, isn't it fabulous? Thank you.
Mm, thank you. That was stunningly beautiful. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for illustrating for us the importance of art and storytelling as a critical tool for waging love, inspiring, and we are so happy that you could ground us for this conversation. Mm. Now, I have the pleasure of welcoming our panelists for this conversation. First, please welcome Dr. Christina Greer, who is an associate professor of political science at Fordham University. She is the author of Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream, as well as How to Build a Democracy from Fannie Lou Hamer and Barbara Jordan to Stacey Abrams. Welcome, 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 Christina.
Thank you
And
so
she
much for
is
having me.
joined, yes. And we are joined also today by Danielle Serid. She is the founder and executive director of Common Justice, an author of the award-winning book, Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair. Welcome, Danielle. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, yes. So how about we get a going? I always like to start off our conversations by asking people, how are you? But also asking you to consider offering some reflections on this. How are you? How are your beloved communities in this moment? And can you frame for us in this moment of American democracy we are currently living in? So, Christina, that is my first question to you. How are you? How is your community? And can you frame this moment in American democracy that we are currently living in?
Well, first things first, thank you so much, Merle, for putting this together. It's always great to spend time with you and your staff. My grandfather used to always say when you'd ask him how he's doing, he would say, I'm among the living and the working, which are two things that a lot of people wish they had. And so I'm trying to keep that in perspective as I bite this elephant one bite at a time. There are a lot of people in my community who are scared, that are filled with anxiety, more so than just the normal run of the mill being a Black person in America and trying not to get murdered on your way to or from work, more so than the average woman who is trying to not be a victim of, sexual violence in the workplace or on the subway or walking to or from work. Um, Ever since November 5th and January 20th, there's been a heightened sense of fear, real legitimate fear that was promised, actually. So how am I feeling? One, I'm always optimistic. I teach the youth of America, so there is a certain level of optimism that I always have because that's a privilege to be with young people and young minds every day. And I recognize that in this particular moment, knock on wood, I am not in the immediate threat, in the immediate crosshairs of this particular administration. So I am charged with keeping a level head and organizing as best I can, raising money in ways that I can, helping organizations in best I can, and using the talents and the gifts that I have of writing and teaching, and speaking to help illuminate ways that people can make themselves of use in this particular moment. So for those of us who aren't facing the real threat of deportation right now, those of us who have jobs right now and have a steady paycheck, and haven't been just fired randomly, because of the whims of particular individuals in this administration, it's incumbent upon us to be sort of, as Al Sharpton talked about, when the geese are flying in that triangular formation, that head goose who takes the headwinds. A lot of Black women are exhausted by that, which is very real and very fair. But for me right now, it's taking some of that headwinds for communities that can't do that right now, communities that are either going into the shadows because of fear, very real, incredible fear and threats and attacks. Taking that headwind for people who, quite honestly, right now don't have the financial means to assist others to do that, and making sure that our social safety net isn't completely eroded. And so there are a lot of smaller organizations, as you know, Everyday Democracy being one of them, who are doing really great work on the ground every day to connect people, to educate people, to inform people, and to give them sort of motivation and marching orders. And so it's my duty in this moment to keep a level head and support those organizations as best I can.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Um, that reflection around using our talents, um, in this moment, in service um, of those aren't who are taking those headwinds, right? Um, Danielle, how are you? And how is your beloved community in this moment? And I invite you to reflect on when you heard about the theme, Waging Love. Um, what feels most important to say as we start this conversation?
Mm. Thank you so much, Merle. Thank you, Dr. Greer. Thank you to everybody who made time to be here with like the extraordinary demands on your time and attention. So one of the things that feels important to say is thank you. I think our gratitude is a sustaining force through all of this. Um, I would echo everything Dr. Greer shared. I think people are struggling. It's a terrifying, enraging, sorrowful time. Um, in so many respects for so many people. And people are in motion, um, more so than I've seen even 4 weeks ago. There's a sort of unfreezing that's happening. I think people are orienting to this moment, to one another, to there in our shared places in history, in our neighborhoods. People are making moves. There is so much to do that I think it can be so overwhelming. And there are so few right answers in the sense of being like clearly conclusive that they'll generate some different future. But I think there are also very few wrong answers right now. Like that the important thing is that we get with other people and we do things we know to be good and we trust our actions will accrue and accumulate to something meaningful. And so I don't mean instead of strategy. I love strategy. I think it's extraordinarily important this time to understand and discern the operations of power and contend with it in a really strategic way. But I also mean like not waiting for a perfect strategy to take the actions that are available to us, so that we don't feel paralyzed by needing to see the entirety of it. Um, and I loved the invitation to talk about waging love. It brought to mind for me a different James Baldwin quote, which is when he says, I love America more than any country in the world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually, right? That love is not, I think we can get a real like Valentine's version of love that's like pink doilies and roses and whatever. I mean, like if you love pink doilies and roses, great. Like may you have all that you desire. And I think love is something else, right? I think love is very sturdy. When Merle, when you and I first talked about this, when you proposed it, I was like, I feel, love is like the human body. It's got these soft, squishy parts, and it also has hard parts. It has firm parts. These parts are in relationship. These parts are always moving, and they are nourishing each other, right? And they are interdependent. And some of them are a little nasty, like bodies aren't all floral, right? Like there's all of this. And so I'm like, yeah, love is like kisses and love is also bones and it's also shitting, right? It's all those things, right? It's the entirety of that. Um, and I think coming from my work, I'm like, love is also about, it includes accountability, it includes repair, right? It includes tending to what we break between and with and among one another, telling each other when we're wrong. I believe everyone who has ever loved any of us deeply has told us at least once that we're wrong. And people do that because they believe in you and they want you to survive. And I think those dimensions of love are really important to lift up and steer into in this moment, that we have to steer into all the parts that are about care and protection, of those we love, of the people most vulnerable among us. And we also have to steer into these parts that are really like beautifully ferocious.
Mm, I love that. Love as accountability. Um, right. And 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 I really appreciate, my colleague Jesse who proposed this topic because I think she understood, right, that waging love as action, yes, and love as an act of accountability to one another and community. So I'm really really appreciating the leaning into that. Thank you both for sharing your reflections on and from your beloved communities and this moment that we're in and what's possible. So I want to move really now a little bit more into this conversation about love. Many would argue that our democratic practices have evolved over time to be more explicit about granting everyone access to inalienable rights found in the Declaration of Independence. But unlike statutory rights, we know that inalienable rights are not contingent upon government legislation or even societal norms, right? Meaning that they are inherently recognized and protected, such as the right to life and being, right? And the right to express, we might call freedom of speech. And that this is fundamentally how one might describe unconditional love, right? You just exist, and that makes you worthy. We seem to be in a moment of actively moving away from some of those commitments in service of something different. So, Dr. Breer, I want to pose this question to you. What political winds are blowing us away from seeing one another as fully human with inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And what does that mean for continuing to build an inclusive democracy that's rooted in love?
So the beauty and the curse of American democracy is that it ebbs and it flows. And so it's not static. And so many of us think that when we have a win, we put it in a frame and we put it on the wall and we think it's a done deal and we pat ourselves on the back and applaud ourselves for making it happen and we walk away from it. We recognize now more than ever that people who don't believe in the same value systems as we do will quickly come behind us and rip it off the wall and tear it to shreds. What I've seen, you mentioned my first book, Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream, is that far too often people fight to sort of be in the in group. And once they're there, they want to pull up the ladder immediately. And so for a lot of us, we thought that demographics would be destiny. And so once you get more people of color, then the society would change and the Voting Rights Act would be solidified and the Immigration Act would be, a non-starter and the Civil Rights Act would be, ironclad. I take all three of those as a triumvirate of acts. And that's not the case. What we're seeing now more and more is that new immigrants actually, and this is the tale as old as time, right? Once they're in, they don't want new people in, right? We saw this with Jewish Americans who came in the 1800s, late 1800s, and then all of a sudden, when you have post-Holocaust Jewish people, they're like, "Oh, please, give me a bad name," right? We saw this when Black communities were established in Harlem, and all of a sudden, after the Great Migration, you start seeing all these Southern Blacks coming up to major cities, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Detroit, New York City, right? Coming from the South with just for some of them, just the clothes on their back is like, ugh, they give me a bad name, right? You're thinking about Black people in fur coats and James Van Der Zee photographs. And so they want to pull up the ladder there, right? We're seeing this in Arizona and Texas with Latinos who are just like, I just got here and I just got my citizenship and I'm barely, in the in crowd, but I don't want these newcomers coming and giving me a bad name. So we see it time and time again. We've seen the Asian communities in New York and all over California. And sadly, this perception of scarce resources that this country promotes. And I say perception of scarce resources because this is one of the most abundant nations ever. There is no such thing as scarce resources. But if I can make you believe that you having something takes away from me, this is why we were never able to get health care, right? FDR couldn't do it. LBJ couldn't do it. Obama did it by the skin of his teeth, but it was always because it's like, well, if I have healthcare and you have healthcare and I don't see us as equal, we can't have the same thing, right? I don't want that. I'd rather have nothing. And so this is what LBJ told us, if you convince the poorest white man that he's better than the Negro, then you can pick his pockets all day long. He says, hell, he'll even empty his pockets for you, right? If you give him enough people to look down on. And we have that in this country. There is since our inception, had we've always had good people in this nation, don't get me wrong. But it is predicated, as Bell Hooks has told us, on this idea of white supremacy, on this idea of anti-Black racism, on this idea of patriarchy, and on this idea of racialized capitalism. And knowing that, and knowing that people subscribe to that because they want to be in the sort of in the winning group, um, that you don't have to be white to be a white supremacist, as we have seen. You don't have to be a man to uphold patriarchy, as we continue to see, right? And we've now seen, you can be Black and be anti-Black at the same time. So I think the 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 fight, the tension has always been in this nation of those of us who want a diverse society, an equitable society, an inclusive society, right? Those of us who have fought for it. There are a lot of white and Black and other Americans who have stood shoulder to shoulder to do so. But part of making it more difficult to do that and make it harder and harder to find the real essence of love. I was a classics minor in college. So I read the Iliad and the Odyssey, like the true essence of love. What does that mean? And Danielle touched on that. It's that if you erase our history, we don't know what that kind of love looks like. You know, I wrote this book about how to build a democracy from Fannie Lou Hamer and Barbara Jordan and Stacey Abrams because it's like, well, we've always been erasing Black people from history. This book banning isn't new, right? I wanted to make sure that Stacey Abrams was codified in text, even though she didn't win, but what she was able to do to deliver a president and two Democratic senators in a time where we needed it as a nation. We have always had people who have worked together. Because to understand this country and how we move forward, to understand American history, you have to understand Black history. You have to understand genocide of Native peoples. You have to understand internment camps. You have to understand Chinese exclusion acts, of which there were several, right? You have to understand how we've always treated Latino populations, especially, annexed in the West Coast and in the sort of Southwest. So all of these things aren't new, right? And we have always been able to overcome it with collective action, with coalition building, right? With people who realistically have put their bodies on the lines for other groups, not just their own. And so to take that out of our public consciousness, to take that off the shelves so people don't know it, don't understand it, can't identify it, then it's all of a sudden we start anew, and it takes that process of making this country a better place. It makes it take just a little bit longer.
Hmm. It's really resonating with me, the connection that you made there around this idea, right? That love is this action, and you described a number of actions that would manifest as, but really noticeably in your comments is this piece around removing information from our public consciousness as a way of erasing not just the history, but our capacity to replicate the kind of loving community and connection that is required to build an inclusive, multiracial, and just democracy. And that's a thread that I think it was dangling out there somewhere for me, but not so clearly woven into the conversation that I'm appreciating. And as I reflect on what's been some efforts recently to erase that public consciousness, it really feels like it's something to be underscored in this moment, and protected. We may not think about it in that way, but to be protected for sure. So thank you for that. Um, love, as we've been talking about it, has been defined as a verb, right? In the conversation, in the reflections that you've all offered so far, including this idea that love is accountable, it's inclusive, and it's generative. And by generative, right? Creative, it's innovative, it's adaptive, it's all the things that perhaps are forward moving. Danielle, in your book, you write about our country's ongoing relationship, maybe even perhaps love affair, with violence, punishment, and dehumanization, and white supremacy tools, right? of control, punishment, exile, and extermination. And you also talk about the opposite of violence. So I'm going to invite you now to respond to this. What is the opposite of violence to you, and how does divesting from the aforementioned tools, control, punishment, exile, extermination, enable us as we work to build an inclusive, multiracial democracy?
I so appreciate the question, and I think it matters to say that I sort of arrived at that list of the core modes of white supremacy from two directions. One is from our work at Common Justice in the criminal legal system, where we work to divert serious and violent crime into restorative justice process. And the other is from observations of the behaviors within my own white family, right? So to know that when we talk about these modes of white supremacy, they're not just about how institutions behave, right? They're about how we as white people are taught to relate, not only to people of color, but also to one another. And those things get embodied in things like the criminal justice system, but they get embodied throughout our culture, not just in the places where they're most obviously manifesting. And so I think about the opposite of violence as reckoning and repair, right? As contending with what happened and making things as right as possible. What we do now is impunity and revenge, right? Those are the options. People get away with things or we exact revenge. That's either retaliatory violence in the street or it's revenge carried out through the criminal legal system. And revenge is a legitimate feeling. I want to be clear. Wanting revenge, I've survived very serious violence. I've lost loved ones to murder. Wanting revenge is natural. Wanting it as an emotion, as a desire, it has its place in all of our processes as we move from loss, from pain, from healing into something else. But revenge doesn't work, right? It's not a functional practice. It doesn't heal us. It doesn't transform the behavior of those who harmed us. I say that more as a physiological observation than a moral one. Like if somebody breaks my arm, if I break their arm, my arm is not then healed by it. Like we are not actually built in a way that inflicting suffering on others relieves our suffering. If it did, it would be an interesting moral question, right? Like, but it's not. We aren't built that way, which means we have to do something else, that we have to do a thing that actually heals it. And so I understand violence not just as being about the infliction of physical pain and injury, but also about as abuse of power, as using one's agency, whether that is individual or institutional, to cause harm. And so the opposite of that isn't more harm. If somebody commits a serious robbery, the opposite of that is not to also inflict a pain on that person. The opposite of that is repair. And it's my belief that an interpersonal relationship without capacity for repair can't survive. Most of us have probably been in one like that. A movement without capacity for repair can't survive. Most of us have been in those. And a country without capacity for repair, I don't believe can survive. And so I think about that. I think about all the repair that we have to do, haven't done. Dr. Greer, you named a ton of it, right? Thinking back to the foundational genocides of this nation, thinking back to slavery, and thinking to the Civil War, to Jim Crow, to now, to all of these places where we have done only impunity and revenge as the outcome and haven't found our way to repair. And so what those core modes of white supremacy do is they replace relationship with power, right? And so if you do that, you rely on shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and the deprivation of people's ability to meet their economic needs. Those are the core individual drivers of violence. They are also the core features of prison. It is part of why prison is so monstrously ineffective at resolving violence and delivering safety. But they're also individualistic responses in a world where violence is generated structurally, right? And it's part of why they don't work. And so we have to have an understanding of the combination of the structural constraints on behavior what deprivation does, what intergenerational trauma does, what divestment from communities do, and at the same time, an understanding of people's individual agency within those confines, the way people retain agency and human dignity, and in that, the capacity to mend the harm that people cause. And so it means that we have to root safety in relationship. We have to invest in structures that support well-being, hospitals, schools, mental health care, libraries, all of it. I mean, you look at the list of things that are being targeted in this moment, those are places where safety is generated, right? Like that's like, you could come to a list of where safety is generated if you look at the most targeted institutions, right? And we have to repair the harms that we do interpersonally and collectively. And so in our work in common justice, we understand the steps of accountability is acknowledging what we've done, acknowledging its impact, expressing genuine remorse, making things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed, and becoming someone who will never cause that harm ever again. We talk about it not as feeling sorry or being sorry or saying sorry, but doing sorry, right? And the way you talk about doing democracy, right? What does that look like as a set of actions? And at Common Justice, we do that for interpersonal violence. And it is my belief that those same steps are applicable to the worst harms we've committed as a nation, right? That they are all scale up. And I think some of this may seem farther than ever right now to like talk about reparations when like everyone's just been told to not speak about DEI, right? Like it may seem incongruent to the moment, but I would argue we have gotten to where we are in part by moving forward without insisting on repair. And that the whole thing about repair is that it's never too late. It gets harder because more harm accumulates. But I don't believe that it ever becomes impossible. And so I think we are at a moment where there is an invitation to us to not just be in a defensive posture, but to continue to insist on the things we actually want, as our opposition always has and always does, whether they are in power or not. I think we have to do the same. And that doesn't mean that we don't do the critical life-saving defensive work that's needed at the time, but it means that we don't also give up on the longer term work that we know is needed to, if we stand a chance of becoming the multiracial democracy like we've only ever aspired to be.
You said so many things and so many threads to pull. But I'll say that the last thing that you said that really, is a thread around this democracy is sort of this ability to have a radical imagination for the democracy we want to live in, right? And that I believe is what's sort of driving the theme of today, right? What would it mean if we literally had the imagination for a democracy that's rooted in an active, loving principle, right? That reflected all of us, and was concerned with our collective well-being. And then there's this thread about replacing relationship with power. That's a really, it's a tough one, right? In a context, Dr. Greer, you're the political scientist amongst us here. In a context in which the way that you get to sort of just talk about and experience, right, in a tangible way, your democracy, so I think there are many ways, is through an electoral process where, you go, you throw your hat behind somebody and they win or they lose, right? And that the standard is to strive to hold the keys of power, right? The levers of power in order to kind of function inside of this context. And so it makes me wonder, right? What would that look like if that power dynamic framework, binary, was rooted in something a little bit more connected to what actually happens to people. I used to work in a what people at the time would have called a poor and working class community on educational access and attainment. And I would dare anybody to say that if you stopped any parent walking down the street in that community and asked them, do you care about your child's education, that they would tell you no. But yet that becomes the narrative, right? But it's only because um, people have gotten out of relationship with one another and have utilized their power to shape the story of who our neighbors are. And again, democracy is literally about our neighbors and our relationship to our neighbors, far and wide, and close at home. Okay, so then let's talk about more closely accountability is loving our democracy. So I believe that the truth will set you free if you reckon with it. Learn that from Danielle. And that accountability invites us into our dignity. And by that, I mean, when we get to lean into what is, like what actually is, not the fantasy, but we have an opportunity to grapple with it, perhaps finding something generative and purposeful in our new understanding. Um, Danielle clearly was reading my mind, because in the setup for this, I also reflected on Baldwin's quote, I love America more than any other country in the world. And exactly for that reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. He frames accountability in this quote as love. Again, love as being relational, clear-eyed, and committed, right, to repair and continuous improvement. So, Christina, I want to ask you, and I want your take, right, on this. In the political arena, accountability and justice are ideals that have shaped our American democracy with huge milestones since our founding in 1776. For those of you who aren't paying attention, we turn 250 next year. So, for example, as these milestones might be ending slavery, expanding access to the ballot, and even acknowledging history or attempting to repair harm. There are examples of that, right? Reparations. It's not a foreign concept. We've been doing it as a nation. And there have been some promising moments around accountability. What do you think on a national scale would a loving accountability look like in action today? So, what would a loving accountability look like in action today, right now, given this context we are in?
Yeah. Well, if you had asked me this question a year ago, so Earth Day 2024, I would say from that moment, we have to sort of build. Interestingly enough, in the span of barely 100 days, we have rolled back so much that accountability, even the beginning semblance of what accountability looks like, is to just get us back to where we were April 22nd, 2024. And that's real. And so, Danielle started off by saying sort of love can be messy. It's like if anyone's ever seen like a baby being born or like a calf being born or a kitten being born, it's like it is not pretty at all. But there's love there, right? And it's mystical and it's magical and all the great things. And this country, as I said, has ebbed and flowed, but we're in a regress moment. And so, your question is predicated on like the position we're in now. It's like, we got to get back to the position where we were 3 months ago. And I don't know how long that takes. There has to be some sort of rewiring, somehow this particular moment has convinced a lot of people of a scarcity mindset. And the scarcity mindset is that there's not enough for us. Therefore, we can't love one another, right? It's like you ask parents, I only have one sister, it's the two of us, right? But you ask parents, it's like, okay, so if you have one kid, you love them 100%. Then you have another kid, and it's like, they're like, yeah, I have two 100%. It's not that you drop down to 50%. It's like I have two 100%. And I think in this country, there are those of us who believe, oh, if I actually have enough where I can share with my neighbor, because my neighbor having only enhances my property value, right? I think paying for public school, even though I don't have kids in public school, makes my country better. I want people educated. Actually, me paying for a public hospital that I may not use, because I have insurance, but I want people healthy. I actually don't want people walking around with tuberculosis or COVID or some sort of disease where it's like you're using the emergency room as your doctor's office. Like, I actually do want to pay into a collective society, but that's not everyone. And so at this particular moment, we have so many people, and I don't think it's the majority though, but we do have a lot of people who fundamentally believe in like, if you have something and then I get it, then it's cut in half, as opposed to this kind of like grandma model, right? Like grandmothers are like, I can have all the grandkids in the world and have all the love of the world. And it like actually it never dissipates. If anything, the more people I have, the more love grows, right? I mean, it's like it's literally the grandma mindset. But that's not what a lot of folks believe. And so, in a democracy that is a constant day commitment, I tell my students all the time, it's like, it's like a marriage. You have to show up every day, as exhausting and disappointing as it sometimes may be. You still have to show up. And I think a lot of people, and this is where I really try and work with young people, and also people who just quite honestly didn't have civics because we don't fund that the way we should. But it's like, this ain't Vegas. You don't try it one time, you lose, and then you walk away. There are a lot of people, it's like, well, my candidate didn't win. I'm out. You don't get to be out. Because then if you leave, then that means you're putting the burden on other people to do your part. It's like when you had color day in elementary school and you played tug of war. It's like you don't get to just slack off because then your team loses if you don't participate. We only win if we all participate. We all sort of take this headwind when we can. And so I think there is this, I remember in 2016 when Hillary Clinton sort of had this idea of love in her campaign. Everyone's like, ugh, let's just, why? Why would we do that? And it's like, because she's trying to counterbalance a different rhetoric that is antithetical to how we can be productive in society. Now, it's not antithetical to the foundation of American democracy. Like, we were not founded on love, period. But she's saying, but we do have the capacity for it. We do have a lot of people in it. Like, there's love in that Underground Railroad, right? There's love in sort of native populations taking in runaway enslaved Africans, right? There's love in white families, hiding black folks as they came north, right? There's love in black folks and Asian folks working together in the Delta. Like, there's a lot of love that has happened over time in this country that A, we don't know it or we're devoid of it, but there is a real movement to make sure that we are filled with anger and fear and competition and scarcity mindsets so that we can't extend ourselves to our neighbors. So on an Easter Sunday, and you wake up and the President of the United States has sent out a message of, all you haters out there, and I'm going to do this and I'm going to go after you. And it's like, you wake up on a Sunday morning, you're a grandpa. You wake up with that on your heart, right? I mean, that's the leader of the nation. That person sets the tone of what is acceptable. And so right now we are in a moment where we actually have to fight against the head of the family if we want to actually move in a space of collective action and coalition building, because that's the only way we've ever gotten anything, insider and outsider politics. We don't get anything without Fannie Lou Hamer and Barbara Jordan. It has to be in the halls of our institutions and also out in the streets with coalitions of people who don't look like us. And the challenge right now, for a lot of Black women especially, is that It's a marathon, not a sprint. And so some of you guys have done one little Saturday of marching and you're exhausted and you think that you can pack it up and go home and hope that the democracy saves itself. That's not how it works. And if you've been paying attention, it's a series of daily decisions. It's years upon years. The civil rights movement started in the 20s and 30s with Jim Crow after Reconstruction. We don't get Brown v. Board until 1954. We don't get the Civil Rights Act until 64. We don't get the Voting Rights Act and the Immigration Act and the Housing Act until 65. These are long, long fights that we have to be in collectively for a long time. And a lot of folks don't know about that temporal space. They know about what's good in their hearts, right? But love isn't quick. Right? It's not a speedy thing. And as Machiavelli tells us, provinces easily won or easily lost, right? Real love takes time to build and it'll take time to destroy. And we need to make sure that we sort of stay shoulder to shoulder in this together. And I think that's the piece right now, the crucial piece. We're helping people understand that this isn't, I don't want quickie love. Now, some coalitions, we can, we don't need to be together forever. We can just fight this fight. But it's like, but a real love needs to be withstanding.
I love that.
I don't
I
want
mean,
booty
that's
call
a
love, basically.
exactly, exactly. I mean, I think, I mean, I'm sure people are clear about that on this call. They understand the difference, right, between the kind of efforts that are made, and quite honestly, what you reap from those efforts, right? That when you're putting that love in, that connection, that relationship, that time, over time, right? Over time, that's how you see these moments. You don't just sort of wake up um and suddenly things have expanded, right? Or folks' belief in the scarcity of what's available has expanded. That requires effort and time over love. And so love as something we commit to um beyond a season, right? Because you're right. Yeah, folks are sort of like, oh, well, we're out of here. It's like, wait a minute, come back. How are we going to pull this off? How are we going to do this democracy thing if people are checking out? So, Danielle, let me turn to you and ask you this question around around this accountability. We've had many conversations, you and I, over the years about accountability and the pressure to avoid owning our own pain points as a democracy. I would like you to think with, let's say, democracy is sitting across from you as one of the parties in your work that has been, you know, maybe it's an injured party, but it's one of the parties in your work, and you're having a conversation about why, right, accountability is something, and why owning the pain points is important. So the question for you is, how have you seen um, accountability strengthen and heal people and community ties? Like what is possible out of accountability in terms of strengthening and healing people and community ties?
So for context, the work I have the privilege to lead at Common Justice includes an alternative to incarceration for serious violence, in which people who have committed crimes like assault, robbery, attempted murders, with the consent of the people who were harmed and of the prosecutor, come into an alternative to incarceration, in which, after extensive preparation, they sit with those they've harmed, reach agreements about how to make things as right as possible. And if they fulfill those, they don't go to the to prison. And in the meantime, we provide wraparound services to the people who've been harmed. And so our work is rooted in restorative justice, and restorative justice teaches us that harm is not about a violation of the law, but of relationship. It's about what you do to the other person, not just a breaking of a rule. And we see all the time, right? The way violence breaks relationship, the way it seeds trauma, the way that trauma lasts, the way fear is everywhere. And in our work, we have the privilege over and over again to watch these things transformed. And part of how that happens for the people responsible, who we call responsible parties, is we hold them in the entirety of their human dignity, which includes acknowledging that what they did is wrong, and includes inviting them into the process of repairing it, so that those things go together. When you see somebody as somebody with power, it means they bear responsibility for choices, but it also means they have the capacity to do something to make things right. One of the things I think that we learn in this work, and that is scales up to this question of democracy, is I really value James Gilligan's work on violence, where he sort of distills shame as a core driver of violence. And of all the things, and I think shame is a strong contender for the worst human emotion. Like, maybe it doesn't win, but no one would object to it being a finalist. And of all the things I know about what releases us from shame, and I mean shame for when we know we've done something wrong, right? That the one thing I know releases us from shame is accountability. And it sort of sucks because accountability is very hard. It's extraordinarily demanding. It requires a transformation of us that punishment never does. Punishment is passive. Accountability is all we have to do to be punished is not escape it. Accountability is active. It requires we engage in those steps of repair I talked about before. And part of that is a requirement that we transform ourselves. But we understand that, I think, the way that engaging in repair releases us from that shame, I think in many ways accountability is like the corollary to grief for those of us who are harmed. Like, when we're harmed, we know we go through these stages of grief. We know we move through a process that over time reconnects us with our own dignity, our self-love, our connection to others, our capacity to hope. And I think when we engage in repair, that also connects us to our own dignity, our self-love, our connection to others, our capacity to hope. And so we see that at the individual level, and at the national level, we have almost no models of having done repair for any of the harms we have caused as a country. And so what that means is that there is a vast persistence of shame. There's an enormous desire among white people to erase the evidence of all we've done. There's a terror of acknowledging that truth, because some part of us doesn't know what it would unleash to actually just be honest, even though that truth is widely known, particularly among Black people, Indigenous people, people who suffered the harms of what we've done. And our continuous insistence on avoiding any real acknowledgement and repair puts us in a cycle where we are obsessed with exactly the kind of erasures that you, Dr. Greer, are talking about, where all of the past has to be denied, all of it can't be known. And it's not just that we can't admit it to Black people, because then we're terrified that Black people would somehow seek revenge, because in white supremacy culture, the only thing you could do in the face of someone admitting such terrible things would be to seek revenge. I think as white folks, we are also terrified to have to tell our own children the stories of what we have done and to try and explain it. And that when we're not in a process of making it right, your choice is when you say, look, we participate in this horrific thing, right? You can either say, and baby, we're engaged in making it as right as we can, or you can say, and baby, they deserved it, right? One or the other, but you have to say something about it. You can't just leave it there. And I think because we are unwilling to engage in the sharing of power and the vulnerability and the risk that would come with actual acknowledgement, we end up in these cycles where we are now. And it's part of why we move forward. And then in the way you're describing, Dr. Greer, that I really value, about where it's just not linear, right? We move forward, but we don't. I think a lot, it's like so many of the wins of the civil rights movement were like when you have a settlement where they give you a bunch of money on the condition of no admission of wrongdoing. Like that condition runs through so much of the progress we make. And at some point, we have to include an admission of wrongdoing. And so while at the same time, there's this incredible aggressive erasure happening, there is also a centrality and honesty about the fight in this country that I think in some ways is welcome. Like we were never going to make it through without this fight. And should we have escalated it when we had more of the levers of power? In my view, yes. Like it's better for for an escalation to happen when you're better positioned. But even then, it's not as though the opposition would have been like, ah, fair point. Thanks for enlightening me. This has always been our fight. This has been the fight since the Civil War, since 1619, in its own way since 1492. And here we are at this moment of it, and called to do whatever our part of it is now. And I think the thing I would say, I'll finish this by talking about a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, which is arguably the corniest thing anyone can talk about. You're like, Merle is like, I brought this white lady, I vouch for her, and now she's talking about caterpillars and shit. Like, what an embarrassment, but bear with me for at least like a minute and you can decide later. So if you've never been to one of these butterfly exhibits, they have them at the Museum of Natural History in New York. You go into the room and butterflies like land on your head. They land on your arms. People are weeping. It's beautiful. It sort of blows your whole mind. And in the corner, they've now made this part of the exhibit prettier. When I first went to it 20 years ago, it was in the corner of the room was this sort of decrepit wooden box. And in it showed the different phases of the caterpillar becoming a butterfly. They had them at the various phases of the progress through that. And it is disgusting. Like it's not like they're a fuzzy caterpillar and they're like, ooh, and their wings sprout, like a little tension in the shoulder and the wings come in. Like they disintegrate. It smells like some combination of death and ass. Like it's disgusting. It must feel like dying. Like what else could it feel like? And it's only at like the very second to last moment that even through the chrysalis, you can see like the faint hint of something that looks like a wing. And many of them don't make it. And I'm like, that's what transformation looks like, right? That's what it looks like in our work with individuals. That's what it looks like for us as a nation. It is not going to be an increasingly celebratory group hug, right? Like that's not what's going to happen. It's not going to be a bouquet that only grows as we each bring our flower to it. Like that's just not what this will be for us. It will be nasty. And I think we can all agree this moment is nasty. And there is something in it where I'm like, we're disintegrating, right? And there is a possibility that this is one of the instances where we do not make it. And there is a possibility that this is one of the instances where we transform, where some of the guardrails about what can and can't be said, some of the guardrails about what will and won't be named have fallen away. And there is an opportunity for us to steer into that with a comparably powerful honesty about how we get out here and how we want to get out. And I think it's available to us even now. And it is available to us through initial practices that are exactly the kind of near-term defensive wins that are necessary. It doesn't mean we're going somewhere other than where that core fight is. We get to do this at those core sites. And we get to, like, the nation is falling apart, right? So I'm like, let us disintegrate. Let us smell, like let the nastiness arise. And let us collectively, in an act of shared power, bring from that a transformation.
Mm. I actually love the butterfly metaphor, because I think that it is, right, a metaphor for transformation and what's possible. You are one thing, and through perhaps a painful and, as you described, smelly process, you can transform into something glorious and beautiful. And I think that that's what's available to us, right? And that's only available to us if we truly love this democracy, right? And why love is such a powerful and animating force. I want to, as we go to the last question from the panelists, from us, invite folks to, you know, provide your questions that you have. We have a couple in there. We'd love to have a few more, as we go into this last, you know, prepared question part for the panelists. And so this is about fostering inclusion and belonging. The work of waging love goes beyond the individual level and requires us to create communities where everyone can belong, right? So, this idea of belonging. Our friends at the Institute for Othering and Belonging define belonging as a powerful vision for creating a world where everyone, person, is seen, valued, and empowered, a world where each individual's humanity is recognized and celebrated, and the planet itself is included in the circle of human concern. So as we move towards sort of our formal, question closing, this question is for both of you. But Dr. Greer, I'll ask you to start. How are different social and political groups doing or not doing belonging right now? And what are we being called to do in this moment to create belonging that's not rooted in empty words, deeds, and philosophies, but in practical attitudes and behaviors that folks can practice when they leave this session today? So, what can people do,
Yeah.
right, to really love this democracy,
Yeah.
when they leave this session today?
Right. And so the first part of your question is like, what are other people doing? And I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how to do it without being penalized, right? And without bringing a microscope to themselves because of the good work that they're doing. So two things that I fundamentally believe in, and this goes with the How to Build a Democracy with Fannie Lou Hamer and Barbara Jordan. So the first is, institutional politics. I believe in political tithing. So, we just had Easter, Pope just passed, there are lots of religious folks in this nation who politically tithe to their religious institutions, mosque, temple, synagogue, church, whatever it may be, because they want to financially invest in seeing that thing thrive. And so that's what the collection plates are for. That's what the monthly donations are for. And so for me, I politically tithe. I tend not to donate to New Yorkers because I talk about them on my podcast. But I donate to people across the country because that's who I want to see lead this nation, right? Whether it's a city council race in whatever small town, whether it's a governor's race in Georgia, whether it's a Senate race in a state that could be a swing state if more people paid attention and participated. Because, a lot of folks who are in city council, they make it to the state house. And we know the state house is where the vast majority of decisions are made and billions upon billions of dollars in New York alone pass through our state houses. But the state house is also a launching pad for a lot of people who go on to Congress and the House of Representatives. And they then parlay that into a Senate position or maybe even a gubernatorial position. And then we know that senators and governors traditionally are in the queue to become presidents. And so there are a lot of senators that I'm looking at saying someone should have cut you off at the knees a long, long time ago. Someone should have supported your opponent in a race that nobody was paying attention to. And in New York, we can send somebody to Albany with barely 2,000 votes. And so that's the political tithing that I do a lot of, making sure I invest in races and individuals, especially people who are starting out for the first time. Obviously an organization like Higher Heights helps make it easy because they sort of identify Black women who are running. An organization like Emily's List makes it easy because they identify pro-choice women who are running. And so that tends to be pro-choice Democratic women because there are no Republican women who believe in a woman's right to choose who are running these days, and autonomy over their body. So those are the types of things that I do in the institution of politics. And then there's so many great organizations that could use a small monthly donation. And if enough of us donated $5 or $10 every month, they could spend a lot more of their time doing programming and not fundraising. and, begging people with their tin can. So it could be an organization that supports Black veterans. It could be an organization that supports girls who like to code and read sci-fi. It can be an organization that helps, formerly incarcerated people or formerly unhoused people get on their feet. So, I support the Brooklyn Public Library because it's down the street, but I also support the Queens Public Library and the New York Public Library, right? Because I want them to actually be able to get whatever books they have or, hire librarians when the city and the state and the federal funding dries up. I can't wait until I have Oprah levels of money to become a philanthropist. I do believe that I'm a philanthropist because I give $10, $15, $20, whatever it may be. I never went to an HBCU, but I give money to HBCUs because I want Black institutions to thrive. I give more money to HBCUs than I give to my own alma maters because they're white institutions with very large endowments. I still give them a little bit of pocket change, but nowhere near what I give Black institutions. So I financially try to invest, and this isn't, thousands upon thousands of dollars, but it's enough for them to sort of pay a light bill over time or send a kid to camp, Troop 6,000 and a Girl Scout troop for unhoused girls, right? I was a brownie for a day and I was like, I don't like organized activities. But knowing that if my parents ever needed to, I went to Catholic school, they had to sell those chocolates and, we were always selling stuff at Catholic school. But they also were in corporate America and they had a place of business to do that. There are a lot of unhoused girls whose moms are the working poor and they aren't in a capacity to bring cookies and sell them. So it's like, I will sell your cookies. I'm gainfully employed. So there are little ways that we can be part of society. You started talking, this call. So we're talking about this like loneliness epidemic that we have and people not feeling connected. And there's so many ways, very small ways that you can, if you don't have $5, you can donate your time. I always tell candidates, I'm like, I've aged out of door knocking. Back in the day when I was a broke graduate student, that's all I could give. I could give my service, I could give my time, I could give my labor. Now I got 1,000 other things that I'm going to do the second I get off this call. I can't give you 6 hours door knocking in the streets of Brooklyn, but what I can do is I can buy pizza for all your volunteers. So we all have a role to play, no matter, and it's not even like big versus small because door knocking is an incredibly important uh, piece, right? Volunteering for an organization, even if it's 2 hours out of the week, is still huge. That's 2 hours that they didn't have to spend money paying someone to do the thing that you were gleefully volunteering to do. So I think that that's, seeing ourselves, you and Danielle have both mentioned this, but as part of the larger quilt that is America, right? David Dinkins, great first Black mayor of New York City, always talking about this beautiful mosaic. But it's like, I'm a quilter, right? So it only works if we can just take all these different fabrics and put them together. And it might be a funky quilt, right? It doesn't have to be patterns. But like it only works if we're all in it. And I think that there's a role for every single person to play. We don't have to wait until we have fancy degrees. We don't have to wait until we have a ton of money. We just don't have to wait. Like that's the key, and if Danielle says we're on the precipice, we either die on the vine or we emerge in a actually more beautiful space that we were, right? This could be the call that we've needed as a nation to have honest conversations dealing with people who we've seen have no shame. And so it's forcing us in a lot of spaces to have hard conversations. But it also gives us an opportunity to do more, to be real Americans, the true Americans, not just the flag waving, but like what does it really mean to uphold these ideals of inclusion for all?
Mm, I love that. And that I love this idea of political tithing. Um, and that really stretches right to the whole a whole sector of tithing, right? Around things that you care, issues that you care about, people and communities that you care about. Um, Danielle, can you talk to us a little bit here about this question? What do people need to be thinking about that they can practice when they leave this call?
Yeah, I think, shortly after the election, I feel like so many of my questions distilled into two and then maybe three main ones. And the first is, do we have or will we build the institutions to absorb the people who will inevitably come our way? Like the number of people being harmed by the policies rolled out day in and day out are vast and include people who have voted for this administration. And the question of whether we have and will build institutions is, I think, really critical. And the second question for me is, do we have the willingness to absorb people who will come our way? I think very often the mainstream left, for lack of a better word, can be a really hostile space to newcomers, to imperfect people, to all sorts of things. I think often it feels like the right does belonging and the left does membership. And membership is conditional and transactional and can be revoked, and it involves minutes and dues and meetings. And that is not what lonely people are seeking, right? That you can feel the precariousness of your inclusion, and that doesn't work for people and it doesn't work to build. And so I think the question of how we transform whom we're able to include and how, which is not about saying we include people without requirement of alignment, of kindness, of decency to one another, but that we start from a place of hospitality and humility. Kianga Yamahata Taylor wrote a wonderful piece on building a hospitable left, or I think it was an interview that was transcribed, but it's really worth a read. And I found it very helpful in thinking about it. But I think it's often like no one is good enough. No one's like too bad for the right and no one's good enough for the left. And that puts us all in a hot mess. And so I think there is a question of, how are we going to build relationships? How are we going to build movements? How are we going to build coalitions that are organized around shared interest? And because we have shared interest, we then have an investment in one another's like dignity and survival, if only because if I need more numbers to win the thing that's good for me, I need you to be alive to come fight along my side, right? Like, how do we drive some of those conversations from a place of organizing, from a place of self-interest and participation? And so I think like what people can do, I think go where you can gather. Like if you are someone who can gather in big marches and that feels good to you, go to them. If you were someone like the day after the election, I took my kid to our local grocery store and went on a bender and we stocked the community fridge to bursting. Is that in itself going to change the course of history? No. And if all of us are behaving in ways that pour into and nurture and help protect the people in our communities, then the people we love and the people we don't know but pass all the time, will that accrue to something? Yes. I also ascribe to a tithing orientation and how I relate to the resources that I have. And I think about it, right, is what are the institutions that embody my values and help anchor the world I want to be in, and what do I contribute to those? I think those are great. And also, like, don't be alone. Find people and do something with them. And you don't have to be willing to take an action that risks your personal safety, that risks your family safety, to be making a meaningful contribution in this time. It will be the quantity of our collective action and our insistence that we do in fact want to be a democracy. Like we do in fact want to live alongside each other in the kind of peace that makes us certain that when our kids leave in the morning, they're going to come home safe at night. Like we want to know that if we are sick, we will be cared for. We want to know that if we are hungry, we will be fed. And we want that for everyone we love. And those things to me are not partisan. I don't know that there is any party that has fully embodied those basic commitments I just said, right? So it's not a question of left, right. It's not a question of red, blue. It's a question of like how we root into these shared values, about how we know that we want our basic needs met and that they will only be met if we're working with other people to ensure that the systems that can provide them act in all of our shared interest. And like whatever you're gonna do, like just do it. Like don't let what is it? Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Like ain't nobody gonna be perfect. Like I'm not close. I have no aspiration of being perfect. None. Like not ever. It's not on the list of things I want to do. I will sooner fly than be perfect. That is true for most of us. And so take the actions that are available, see what they work, experiment with it, try what feels good. And everything we do together, like everything you do, like, Miriam Kaba says, everything worth doing, we do with other people. And I think it's true. And I think it is also a balm against so much of our fear, to be moving with one another in such a fearful time.
Mm, indeed. Indeed. Wow. So, so many gems. I hope that folks are really, truly, truly taking in what you all are offering us today. We're going to turn to our group who's been with us. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Jesse, to offer a question the from the Q&A of folks who've been on this call. As we are coming to the end of our time together, uh, we had about 4 minutes left before we turn it back over to our wonderful poet to close us out. So, Jesse.
Yes. So one of the questions we have, and I will direct this to Danielle to start out in hopes that we can hear from you as well as Dr. Greer. Who do you look to as tactical movement leaders who are waging love right now?
I think there are so many. I think I have been really inspired by the National Working Families Party and Indivisible and the sheer number of people they have gathered. One of the things that distinguishes them is um, how easy it is to participate, like how easy they have made it for everyone to participate, which I think is hugely important in this moment. Um, I said something about Miriam Kappa earlier. She is one of my North Stars and teachers, and being able to really look squarely at what is happening, even when it is horrific, and not blink, so that we can actually act with real discernment. I think there's some really beautiful, the of emergent brilliance of people like Adrienne Marie Brown and Autumn Brown, who have a podcast together that's wonderful, that I think really nourish our ability to think in imaginative and creative spaces in this time, and to think long term, to think historically, to think generatively, which I think is a thing that gets really shut down in the onslaught. I think the folks that choose democracy and waging nonviolence, including Daniel Hunter, who's prepared for this moment for years and has been clear-sighted for so many of us in the first moments, is also an extraordinary resource. And then I look also to my neighbors, right? Like I look to people whose names you're not, like, you can Google and it won't be helpful, right? Like I also really think about the leadership of the people who have co-created safety on our block and in our neighborhood for generations through all sorts of different circumstances, for answers about what the most like hyper local solutions in this moment might be. And I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody where later I will hate myself for not having said their name on this call. So like, may I have a placeholder of deep respect, admiration, and gratitude for whoever that is.
It's like the Oscars. Should we write it down?
No, when I wrote my book,
Want to miss anybody?
the only part of my book I was terrified about was the acknowledgments. Because the rest of it, I was like, of
That's
course,
right.
some of it is wrong, and hopefully I'll learn and I'll
That's
get better.
right.
The
That's
acknowledgement
right.
section is
That's right.
terrifying.
Dr. Greer, same question. Are there folks you're looking to that are waging love in this moment, that are, tactical leaders around this?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm looking at just like kind of people I know, like people who are just kind of holding it together in my inner circle. As far as like electeds, I always, find someone say like Ayanna Pressley to be like an honest arbiter of the moment. Um, yeah, I don't, like I don't really have kind of a list of people. I like organizations that are doing, great work. I mean, I'm just thinking about like the Octavia Project, right? That like sort of helps young girls, read sci-fi and write sci-fi. Like I think that there's so many people, like Danielle has the people who are doing it right now, and it's like very clear. I'm sort of like, I'm just kind of keep my eye on folks that are just like plugging away, and it's like education, right? You don't see it right now, but like they're planting seeds that like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the same way we won't ever know the damage that is being done on one hand, we don't know the great seeds that are also being planted by folks on the other hand.
I love that answer because I think that this is the moment that we're in, this planting seeds, but also reaping, right? The harvest of the wisdom that people have been curating over time. There's so much more. There's so much more we could discuss, but I just want to say thank you. Um, Thank you all. Thank you to the folks who've been with us for joining us in this third conversation of Doing Democracy series. We have more coming up in the year. You'll get an email about that and past events, future events. Visit our website, everyday-democracy.org to see some of those recordings. And now I'd like to close us out. Well, again, to thank again Dr. Christina Greer and Daniel Serid for your wisdom, your time, your energy, your inspiration. It's gratitude, like I can't express enough gratitude for what you've offered us in this conversation today. So thank you truly. And I want to now turn to Dasan Ahanu, who's going to close us out with a beautiful poem. He's titled Everything Worth Fighting For. Dasan, you have us.
Thank you. There is a joy that comes with seeing groups of children playing in an open field, a twinge in your gut that comes when passing a sun-kissed testimony in tattered clothes, holding court on a corner, a smile that forms when a phone call affirms that hard work has placed another snapshot of Black excellence where the world can see, an affirming head nod that says that in a room full of obstacles and expectation, we belong here. There is the pride that beams at youthful recital, cheers that accompany athletic achievement, a hug that starter pistols the next glorious gathering of friends, laughter that chronicles the best of times, tears that fall during the worst times. These are the moments that let us know that there is so much worth fighting for. I know a cadre of will talking about toppling institutions and dismantling systems of oppression in the back room of a church, 2 prayers from a liquor house, down the street from a school named after an optimist, around the corner from a complex considered an eyesore with low property values that has birthed more blessings than bastards. These dedicated rebels are planning demonstration, coordinating childcare, identifying roles and tasks, building with a capacity and a passion unmatched. Their discussions are a joyful noise. These are the visionaries that know that there is so much worth fighting for. See, there's promise wrestling with purpose in the classroom during the late hour. They are inspired by the tales of ancestors before, searching for victory after. They came with questions and are leaving with a focused strategy. This is where developing minds seek greater understanding past professors and syllabi together. Here, careers and families are distant actualization of a tuition-paid journey today. Today is where they sharpen their skills at crafting a wonderfully sculpted happy ending. Tomorrow, they will march and demand, pushing administration to consider that dorm rooms are not margins, that the blueprints of their future should have etchings from their own hands. They are everything worth fighting for. They are neighborhoods to reclaim, lost lives to honor with resilience, names to say, legacies to build, ancestors to invoke, text to review, positions to be held, stories to be told, lessons to be learned, insight to be passed, programs to be developed, work to be done. My God, don't you feel it? Can't you see it? There is truth, clothesline along the horizon, hung by angels who want us to see what this world is meant to be. There, drying by the light of the sun, is woven inspiration covered in the tears of those who left before the battle was won. Sitting in your house right now is a mirror with an honest tongue. It has a glimmer in its eye and it's waiting to have a heart-to-heart conversation with you. It has a message to deliver in familiar clarity, a promise to make, a revelation to share, a desire to let you know that if you look there, that it can show you everything worth fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you.